The throne room fell into absolute silence as Seraphina placed her hands on Drakeon's chest. She could feel it all. Every scar he had left on other hearts. Every tear shed because of him. Every life he had shattered. The curse pulsed beneath her fingertips like a second heart, beating with the rhythm of 1,000 agonies. His silver eyes met hers, and for the first time since their forced union, she saw not the cold prince who had conquered kingdoms, but a man drowning in an ocean of pain he had created. "I can end this," she whispered, her magic crackling between them like lightning. "But first, tell me, do you deserve to be saved?" The question hung in the air like a blade, and in that moment, both their fates balanced on the edge of forgiveness and revenge. The parchment arrived at dawn, carried by a raven whose eyes burned like embers against the morning mist. Seraphina's hands trembled, not from the cold mountain air that swept through her tower sanctuary, but from the weight of the crimson seal that bore the mark of 2 kingdoms. She'd spent 26 years mastering magic that could level cities, yet a single piece of paper threatened to destroy everything she'd built. The Sorceress Empire's most powerful mage, reduced to a political pawn in a game she never agreed to play. "Marriage decree," she whispered to the empty chamber, her voice echoing off ancient stone walls lined with spellbooks and artifacts. The words felt foreign on her tongue, like speaking a curse in a language she'd never learned. Her magic sparked involuntarily, sending blue flames dancing across her fingertips as she read the terms again. 3 days. That's all the time they'd given her to prepare for a union that would bind not just her fate, but the destiny of 2 warring realms. The irony wasn't lost on her. She who had dedicated her life to freedom, to the pursuit of knowledge without chains, was about to be shackled to a man whose very name made seasoned warriors wake in cold sweats. Prince Drakeon of the Dragon Realm, the Ice Prince, the Heartless Conqueror. Stories of his brutality had reached even her isolated tower, whispered by merchants and carried on the wind by desperate refugees. But as Seraphina stared out her window at the kingdom she'd sworn to protect, she felt the familiar weight of duty settling on her shoulders like a lead cloak. Her people needed this peace, even if it cost her everything. Even if it meant walking into the dragon's den with nothing but her magic and a heart full of defiance. The question that haunted her wasn't whether she could survive marriage to a monster. It was whether she'd still be herself when the flames finally died down. Little did she know, the monster she feared was fighting battles of his own, and some chains cut deeper than any sword. The sky darkened at noon, and it had nothing to do with storm clouds. Seraphina watched from her balcony as a massive shadow swept across the capital, followed by a roar that shook the very foundations of the Sorceress Empire's greatest stronghold. When Prince Drakeon descended from the heavens in his dragon form, the transformation from beast to man was like watching lightning strike in reverse. Violent, beautiful, and absolutely terrifying. He stood in the courtyard below, silver hair catching the filtered sunlight, his presence commanding attention from every soul within a mile radius. Even from her tower, Seraphina could feel the cold emanating from him like winter given human form. The way he moved spoke of calculated precision, every gesture deliberate, every glance sharp enough to cut glass. This wasn't just a man. This was a weapon wrapped in royal silk and diplomatic immunity. "Well, ain't he a sight for sore eyes?" muttered Alara, her lady-in-waiting, though her voice carried more fear than admiration. The older woman had served the royal family for decades, but even she seemed to shrink back from the windows. "Looks like trouble walking on 2 legs, if you ask me." Seraphina couldn't argue with that assessment, especially when she noticed how the palace guards kept their distance, forming a wide circle around their unwelcome guest. What struck her most wasn't his reputation or his obvious power. It was the way he held himself, like a man carrying invisible weights. There was something in his posture, a tension that spoke of more than just political formality. For a split second, when he looked up toward her tower, their eyes met across the distance. The connection lasted barely a heartbeat, but it was enough to send an unexpected shiver down her spine. As the welcoming committee approached with all the enthusiasm of condemned prisoners, Seraphina found herself wondering what kind of man chose to arrive as a dragon when he could have come in peace. Was it intimidation? Or was there something else driving him to make such a dramatic entrance? Tomorrow, she would learn that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who've forgotten how to be anything else. The binding ritual took place in the Grand Cathedral, where ancient magic hummed through marble columns carved with protective runes. Seraphina had attended dozens of royal ceremonies, but nothing had prepared her for the raw power that filled the air when two magical bloodlines were forced to intertwine. The very atmosphere seemed to crackle with potential energy, like the moment before lightning strikes, when every hair on your body stands on end. She wore her grandmother's wedding dress, white silk embroidered with silver threads that caught the light like captured starlight. Across from her, Drakeon stood in ceremonial black, his expression unreadable as stone. But when the High Priestess began the incantation that would bind their kingdoms through their union, something unexpected happened. Their magic reached for each other like old friends reuniting after years apart. The sensation was unlike anything Seraphina had ever experienced. Her ice-blue magic, usually sharp and controlled, seemed to soften as it touched his silver-white power. For a moment that felt like eternity. She could sense something beneath his carefully constructed walls, a pain so deep it took her breath away. It was there and gone in an instant, but the echo of it lingered in her chest like a bruise. By fire and ice, by earth and sky, let these two souls be bound until the stars fall from the heavens, the priestess intoned, her voice carrying the weight of centuries-old tradition. As their hands were joined with ceremonial chains forged from dragon scale and sorceress crystal, Seraphina felt a connection snap into place that went far beyond political alliance. It was intimate, invasive, and absolutely terrifying. Draken's grip tightened almost imperceptibly when the binding completed, and for just a second, his mask slipped. She saw something flicker in his silver eyes, surprise, maybe even relief, before the cold prince returned. But the damage was done. Whatever she'd felt in that moment of magical connection, she knew he'd felt it too. As they walked down the aisle as husband and wife, neither realized they'd just signed up for a dance with destiny that would change them both forever. The Dragon Prince's chambers were nothing like Seraphina had expected. Instead of the cold, intimidating fortress she'd imagined, she found herself in a space that spoke of quiet elegance, dark wood furniture, books scattered on every surface, and windows that offered a breathtaking view of both kingdoms. It was the room of a scholar, not a conqueror, and the contradiction left her more unsettled than any throne room ever could. Drakeon stood by the fireplace, still in his ceremonial attire, but somehow looking less imposing in the warm glow of the flames. "I know what you're thinking," he said, without turning around, his voice carrying that distinctive edge that made people listen whether they wanted to or not. "You're wondering if the stories are true, if I'm going to live up to my reputation as the monster who married the Empire's greatest sorceress." "Actually," Seraphina replied, settling into a chair near the window with more confidence than she felt, "I was wondering why a man with your reputation has more books than weapons in his private chambers." She gestured to the overflowing bookshelves that lined the walls. "Doesn't exactly scream Heartless Conqueror to me." The silence that followed was loaded with unspoken questions. When he finally turned to face her, there was something almost vulnerable in his expression. Gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "Perhaps," he said carefully. "The stories don't tell the whole truth." He moved to pour 2 glasses of wine, his movements precise but not threatening. "I won't pretend this arrangement is what either of us wanted, but we're bound now. The question is, what do we do with that reality?" As he handed her the wine, their fingers brushed, and that strange connection from the ceremony sparked again. This time she was ready for it, but the intensity still caught her off guard. There was pain there, yes, but also something else, a loneliness so profound it made her chest ache. For a man who commanded armies and conquered kingdoms, he seemed remarkably isolated. "We survive it," she said finally, meeting his gaze with steady determination. "And maybe, if we're lucky, we figure out how to make it work." What she didn't say was that she was already beginning to suspect there was far more to Prince Drakeon than anyone realized. But some secrets are buried so deep that even their owners forget they exist. And the truth about her new husband was darker than she could possibly imagine. Dawn in the Dragon Palace came with a symphony of sounds Seraphina had never heard before. The distant roar of dragons in the training yards, the clash of weapons, and underneath it all, a low humming that seemed to emanate from the very stones. She'd barely slept, her mind racing with questions about the man who'd left their chambers before sunrise without a word of explanation. Now, wandering the corridors in search of answers, she felt like an intruder in a world that operated by rules she didn't understand. The servants moved like ghosts through the halls, their eyes downcast whenever she passed. But she caught their whispered conversations, fragments of stories that painted a picture of their prince that didn't match the man she'd met the night before. Burned down 3 villages last month, one maid murmured to another. Didn't even blink when they begged for mercy. Yet the same servants spoke of his fairness in settling disputes, his protection of the weak, his unexpected acts of kindness that seemed to contradict every tale of cruelty. "You're up early for a new bride," came a voice from behind her. Seraphina turned to find an elderly woman with silver hair and knowing eyes, dressed in the deep blue robes of a palace healer. "I'm Mira, the prince's, well, let's call me his conscience when he remembers he has one." There was warmth in her voice, but also a sadness that spoke of years spent watching someone she cared about make choices that broke her heart. "The stories about him," Seraphina began, then stopped, unsure how to voice the questions that had kept her awake. "Are they true?" Mira's expression grew complicated, like someone trying to explain color to the blind. "Truth is a funny thing in a place like this, child. Sometimes the most terrible stories hide the most terrible pain." Before Seraphina could ask what she meant, a sound echoed through the corridor, a low, agonized groan that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. Mira's face went pale, and she grabbed Seraphina's arm with surprising strength. "You didn't hear that," she said urgently. "Whatever you think you heard, you didn't hear it." But as they stood there in the suddenly silent hallway, Seraphina felt that strange connection from the ceremony pulse with something that felt remarkably like suffering. Some secrets have a way of revealing themselves, no matter how deep they're buried, and the truth about Prince Drakeon was about to surface in ways that would change everything. The war room was a testament to strategic brilliance and barely contained violence. Maps covered every surface, marked with colored pins that told the story of 100 conflicts, while weapons from conquered territories hung on the walls like trophies. Seraphina entered to find herself the only woman among 24 hardened warriors, their conversations dying as they registered her presence with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. Drakeon commanded the room from the head of a massive oak table, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade as he outlined their response to border skirmishes with the northern clans. Watching him work was like observing a master craftsman, every word calculated, every gesture purposeful, every decision backed by an intelligence that was both impressive and terrifying. This was the man who had conquered half the known world before his 30th birthday, and suddenly those stories seemed a lot more believable. "The northern clans think our marriage makes us weak," he said, his silver eyes finding hers across the room. "They're about to learn how wrong they are." The way he said it sent a chill down her spine, but not entirely from fear. There was something almost protective in his tone, as if their union had given him something worth defending beyond political advantage. But then came the moment that changed everything. A scout reported civilian casualties from the latest raid, and for just an instant, Seraphina saw Drakeon flinch. It was subtle, a tightening around his eyes, a barely perceptible intake of breath, but through their bond, she felt it like a physical blow. Pain, sharp and immediate, as if he'd been struck. The reaction was gone so quickly she might have imagined it, but the echo of it lingered in her chest. "Double the patrols," he ordered, his voice steady despite whatever he'd just experienced, "and send aid to the affected villages, full compensation for their losses." The generals exchanged glances. Apparently such mercy wasn't typical behavior for their prince. As the meeting continued, Seraphina found herself watching him more carefully, noting the subtle signs of distress that seemed to accompany every report of violence or suffering. By the time the council ended, she was beginning to suspect that the Ice Prince's reputation might be both his greatest weapon and his most carefully guarded secret. The palace gardens were a sanctuary of impossible beauty, where dragonfire roses bloomed alongside ice lilies in defiance of natural law. Seraphina had discovered them by accident while exploring, drawn by the sound of running water and the promise of solitude. She hadn't expected to find Drakeon there, sitting on a stone bench with a book in his lap, looking more human than she'd ever seen him. "Advanced Theoretical Magic by Archmage Valdris," she observed, reading the title over his shoulder. Not exactly light reading for a warrior prince. He didn't startle at her approach, but she caught the slight tension in his shoulders, as if he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't. "I didn't take you for a scholar of magical theory. There's a lot you don't know about me," he replied, closing the book but not moving away when she settled beside him on the bench. Just as there's a lot I don't know about you. For instance, I know you're the most powerful sorceress of your generation, but I don't know why you never married, never took a position at court, never did any of the things expected of someone with your abilities. The question caught her off guard with its perceptiveness. Most people saw her power and assumed they understood her story, but Drakeon had identified the very thing that made her different from her peers. Freedom, she said simply. I've seen what happens to powerful women who tie themselves to powerful men. They become accessories to someone else's ambition. And now? He asked, and there was something almost vulnerable in the question. What are you now? The way he looked at her made her feel like he was seeing past all her carefully constructed defenses, straight to the heart of who she really was. It was unsettling and oddly comforting at the same time. I'm still figuring that out, she admitted, surprised by her own honesty. But I'm beginning to think that maybe some chains are worth wearing if they're forged by choice rather than force. The silence that followed was comfortable, filled with the sound of water and the distant calls of dragons. For the first time since their marriage, she felt like she was talking to a man rather than a title. But as they sat together in the fading light, neither realized that someone was watching from the shadows, and their growing connection had not gone unnoticed by those who preferred the prince to remain isolated. The attack came without warning during the evening meal, when palace defenses were at their most relaxed. Seraphina was reaching for her wine glass when the explosion rocked the dining hall, sending crystal and china crashing to the floor in a symphony of destruction. Through the smoke and chaos, she saw masked figures pouring through the shattered windows, assassins with blades that gleamed with poison and eyes that promised death. Instinct took over as her magic flared to life, ice crystals forming in the air around her like deadly flowers. But before she could strike, Drakeon was there, moving with inhuman speed to intercept a blade aimed at her heart. The assassin's weapon caught him across the ribs, tearing through silk and flesh with equal ease, and his blood splattered across her white dress like crimson rain. "Stay behind me," he growled, his own magic erupting in silver flames that turned the attacker's weapons to molten metal. But as he fought, Seraphina noticed something wrong. Every blow he landed, every life he took, seemed to cause him physical pain. His face contorted with each strike, as if he were fighting two battles simultaneously. When the last assassin fell, Drakeon collapsed to one knee, his hand pressed to his wounded side. Without thinking, Seraphina reached out to help him, her palm pressing against his chest to channel healing magic. The moment their skin made contact, the world exploded into sensation. Through their bond, she felt everything, not just his physical pain from the wound, but something far worse. A crushing weight of agony that had nothing to do with the assassin's blade, and everything to do with the lives he'd just taken. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the ringing in her ears. The pain flowing through their connection was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. Layer upon layer of suffering that seemed to stretch back years, maybe decades. It wasn't just his wound she was feeling. It was as if every act of violence he'd ever committed was carved into his very soul, a living testament to choices that haunted him with physical agony. Drakeon jerked away from her touch as if she'd burned him, his silver eyes wide with something that looked dangerously close to panic. "You felt it," he said, and it wasn't a question. His carefully constructed mask was cracking, revealing glimpses of a man who carried burdens that would have broken lesser souls. "You weren't supposed to. The bond shouldn't be that strong yet." As guards rushed into the destroyed dining hall and healers tended to the wounded, Seraphina stared at her husband with new understanding dawning like a terrible sunrise. The Ice Prince, the Heartless Conqueror, the man whose very name struck fear into the hearts of his enemies. He was suffering in ways that defied imagination, and somehow, she was the only one who could feel it. The palace felt different after the attack, as if the very walls had absorbed the violence and were now whispering secrets in the darkness. Seraphina lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling while her mind raced with questions that had no easy answers. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt echoes of that crushing pain she'd experienced when touching Drakeon, and sleep seemed as distant as the stars beyond her window. Through their bond, stronger now after that moment of connection, she could sense him moving restlessly in his chambers. The man who commanded armies and conquered kingdoms was pacing like a caged wolf, and she could feel his turmoil as clearly as her own heartbeat. It was maddening, this unwanted intimacy with someone who was still essentially a stranger. Yet she found herself drawn to his suffering like a moth to flame. "Can't sleep either, huh?" The voice came from her balcony, and she turned to find Drakeon silhouetted against the moonlight. He'd climbed up from his own balcony below, a feat that should have been impossible for anyone without wings. But then again, dragon princes played by different rules. "I could feel your restlessness through the bond. Figured we might as well be awake together." She wrapped a robe around herself and joined him outside, where the night air carried the scent of dragonfire roses and something else, something that reminded her of winter mornings and old sorrows. "That pain I felt," she began, then stopped when she saw him tense. "It wasn't from the wound, was it? It was something else entirely." "Some conversations are better left for daylight," he said, but there was no real conviction in his voice. He looked exhausted, like a man who'd been fighting a war for so long he'd forgotten what peace felt like. "Besides, you wouldn't believe me if I told you. Hell, most days I don't believe it myself." But as they stood together under the star-filled sky, both knew that some truths have a way of demanding to be heard, regardless of whether anyone is ready to listen. The palace library was a cathedral of knowledge, with shelves that stretched toward vaulted ceilings and contained texts from every corner of the known world. Seraphina had discovered it during her restless wandering, drawn by the promise of answers to questions that kept her awake at night. What she hadn't expected was to find evidence that someone else had been asking the same questions. Books on curses, magical bonds, and the price of power lay scattered across a reading table like breadcrumbs leading to a terrible truth. "Researching your new husband." The voice belonged to Master Aldrich, the palace's chief librarian, a man whose age was impossible to determine, but whose eyes held the weight of centuries. He moved between the shelves with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent more time with books than people, his fingers trailing over ancient spines like a lover's caress. "Trying to understand him," she corrected, settling into the chair where someone, Drakeon, she suspected, had been conducting their own research. "There's something wrong with him, something that goes deeper than politics or reputation. I can feel it through our bond, but I can't make sense of it." Aldrich's expression grew thoughtful as he pulled a leather-bound tome from a high shelf, its cover marked with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the lamplight. "Ah, you're talking about the old magic, aren't you? The kind that leaves marks on the soul rather than the flesh." He opened the book to a page that made Seraphina's blood run cold, an illustration of a man writhing in agony, surrounded by ghostly figures that seemed to be tearing at his very essence. "The curse of empathetic retribution," Aldrich read aloud, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "A punishment reserved for those whose cruelty knows no bounds. The cursed one feels every pain they've ever inflicted, experiences every moment of suffering they've caused, as if it were happening to them in real time." He looked up at her with eyes that held both pity and fear. "It's considered one of the most terrible fates that can befall a person, because it turns their own actions into instruments of torture." As the implications of his words sank in, Seraphina felt the pieces of a horrifying puzzle beginning to fall into place, and she realized that her husband wasn't just a conqueror. He was a man being slowly destroyed by the weight of his own choices. The morning hunt was a tradition as old as the dragon realm itself, where nobles and warriors gathered to test their skills against the wild beasts that roamed the northern forests. Seraphina had been invited, or perhaps commanded, to attend, and she found herself mounted on a spirited mare, surrounded by men who looked at her with barely concealed skepticism. After all, what did a sorceress know about the ancient art of the hunt? The answer, as it turned out, was more than they expected. When a massive dire wolf broke from the underbrush, its eyes glowing with predatory hunger, Seraphina's magic responded before conscious thought could intervene. Ice crystals formed in the air, creating a barrier between the beast and a young page who'd been thrown from his horse. But it was Drakeon who delivered the killing blow, his sword finding the creature's heart with surgical precision. What happened next made her blood run cold. The moment the dire wolf's life ended, Drakeon doubled over as if he'd been struck by an invisible fist. Through their bond, she felt it, a wave of pain so intense it nearly knocked her from her saddle. It wasn't the wolf's death throes she was experiencing. It was something far more complex, as if the act of taking life had triggered some internal mechanism of suffering. "Magnificent kill, Your Highness," called Lord Garrett, one of the younger nobles who seemed oblivious to his prince's distress. Clean and quick, just like always. The other hunters murmured their agreement, but Seraphina noticed how quickly Drakeon straightened, his mask of cold control sliding back into place like armor donned for battle. The beast was threatening innocence, he said simply, his voice steady despite what she'd felt through their connection. There was no choice. But as the hunting party continued deeper into the forest, Seraphina found herself watching him more carefully, noting the subtle signs of distress that followed every act of violence, no matter how justified. By the time they returned to the palace, she was beginning to understand that the Ice Prince's reputation for efficiency in battle might be less about natural talent and more about a desperate need to end conflicts as quickly as possible, before the pain became unbearable. The confrontation came that evening in the privacy of their shared chambers, where the weight of unspoken truths had finally become too heavy to bear. Seraphina found Drakeon standing by the window, his reflection ghost-like in the glass, and she could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a forge. The careful dance they'd been performing around each other was about to end, and they both knew it. "I know about the curse," she said without preamble, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "The curse of empathetic retribution. I know that every life you take, every act of violence you commit, comes back to you as physical pain." She watched his shoulders tense, saw his hands clench into fists at his sides, but he didn't turn around. "You don't know anything," he replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "You've read some dusty old books and think you understand what it means to live with the consequences of your choices. But understanding and experiencing are two very different things, princess." "Then explain it to me," she challenged, moving closer until she could see his reflection clearly in the window. "Help me understand why the most feared warrior in the known world flinches every time he draws blood. Why the Ice Prince carries himself like a man bearing invisible wounds. Why you research curses in the middle of the night like you're looking for a way out of hell." When he finally turned to face her, the raw pain in his silver eyes nearly stole her breath. "You want to know what it's like?" he asked, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Imagine feeling every moment of terror from every person you've ever killed. Every last breath, every final thought, every prayer for mercy that went unanswered. Now imagine carrying that with you every second of every day for the past 15 years. The silence that followed was deafening, filled with the weight of a confession that changed everything between them. Seraphina felt tears she hadn't expected burning behind her eyes, not for herself, but for the man who'd been slowly dying under the weight of his own actions. As they stood there in the lamplight, two people bound by politics but connected by something far deeper, she realized that some prisons are built not of stone and iron, but of guilt and consequence. And her husband had been serving a life sentence for crimes that had made him a legend. The ancient dragon who emerged from the depths of the palace crypts was older than kingdoms, her scales dulled to the color of tarnished silver, and her eyes holding the wisdom of centuries. Seraphina had sought her out on Aldrich's advice, following winding passages that led deep into the mountain's heart, where the air itself seemed thick with accumulated secrets and forgotten sorrows. "So," the dragon said, her voice like wind through autumn leaves, "the new princess seeks answers about her cursed prince. I wondered when someone would finally ask the right questions." She settled her massive form on the cavern floor, her presence both comforting and terrifying in the way that only truly ancient beings could manage. "You know about the curse," Seraphina said, and it wasn't a question. "You know how it happened, why it happened. Everyone else speaks in riddles and half-truths, but you were there, weren't you?" The dragon's laugh was like distant thunder, rumbling through the stone chambers with bitter amusement. "Oh, child, I didn't just witness it. I helped cast it." The admission hit Seraphina like a physical blow, and she felt her magic flare in response to her shock. 15 years ago, Prince Drakeon was everything his reputation claimed and worse. He burned villages for sport, killed prisoners for entertainment, and showed mercy only when it served his strategic purposes. He was brilliant, beautiful, and absolutely without conscience. The dragon's eyes grew distant, lost in memories that clearly brought her no joy. The curse was meant to teach him empathy, to make him feel the weight of his choices. We thought, hoped, that experiencing the pain he caused would change him, make him into the leader his people needed, rather than the monster he'd become. Her massive head lowered, until she was eye level with Seraphina. We never imagined he'd continue fighting despite the agony, that he'd bear the suffering in silence rather than change his ways. But as the dragon's words sank in, Seraphina realized that the curse had worked in ways its creators never intended. It hadn't made Drakeon stop being a warrior, but it had transformed him into something far more complex and tragic than anyone could have foreseen. The revelation about the curse's origins changed everything, and nothing at the same time. Seraphina found herself watching Drakeon with new eyes during the days that followed, seeing past the cold mask to the man who carried the weight of 1,000 deaths in his soul. Their bond, strengthened by shared knowledge and growing understanding, had become a conduit for emotions neither of them had asked for, but couldn't ignore. It started small, a flash of his pain, when he made a particularly difficult decision, an echo of his exhaustion when he thought no one was watching. But as the days passed, the connection deepened, until she could feel his suffering as clearly as her own heartbeat. It was like being slowly submerged in an ocean of accumulated guilt and consequence, and she began to understand why he'd built such formidable walls around his heart. "You're feeling it too now, aren't you?" Mira, the palace healer, found her in the gardens one afternoon, looking pale and drawn. "The curse doesn't just affect him anymore. It's bleeding through your bond, making you share his burden." The older woman's expression was filled with a mixture of sympathy and concern that made Seraphina's chest tighten. "How do you bear it?" Seraphina asked, thinking of the crushing weight she'd experienced during their brief connection. "How does he function with that kind of pain?" Mira settled beside her on the stone bench, her weathered hands folding in her lap like birds coming to rest. "The same way anyone survives the unbearable," she replied softly. "One breath at a time, one choice at a time, one day at a time. But it's killing him slowly, wearing him down like water on stone. The curse was meant to teach him empathy, but instead it's taught him that every action has a price, and he's been paying it in blood and suffering for 15 years. As Seraphina sat in the fading afternoon light, feeling the distant echo of her husband's pain through their bond, she began to understand that love sometimes meant choosing to share someone's darkness, rather than trying to drag them into the light. The opportunity came during a border dispute that required Drakeon's personal attention, a conflict that would inevitably end in bloodshed, and consequently, in his suffering. Seraphina had been studying the magical theory behind empathetic transference for days, poring over ancient texts that described techniques for sharing or redirecting magical burdens. The theory was sound, but the practice was dangerous, potentially deadly if performed incorrectly. She waited until he was preparing for battle, his armor gleaming in the pre-dawn light as he reviewed tactical reports with his generals. Through their bond, she could already feel his dread, not of the coming fight, but of the pain that would follow. It was a familiar sensation by now, this anticipation of agony that preceded every conflict, and it broke her heart in ways she hadn't expected. Working carefully, she wove her magic around their existing bond, creating a buffer that would absorb some of the curse's impact before it reached him. The spell was delicate work, requiring her to essentially volunteer to share his suffering while maintaining enough distance to avoid being overwhelmed herself. It was like trying to catch lightning in a bottle while standing in a thunderstorm. The battle was swift and decisive, as Drakeon's conflicts usually were. But when it ended, and the inevitable wave of empathetic pain crashed over him, something was different. Instead of the crushing agony that normally followed violence, he experienced something more manageable, still painful, but bearable. Through their bond, Seraphina felt his confusion and, underneath it, a flicker of something that might have been hope. "What did you do?" he asked when he returned to the palace, finding her in their chambers looking pale but determined. His silver eyes searched her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as if he could see straight through to her soul. The pain, it was different, lessened somehow. As she met his gaze, Seraphina realized that some gifts can't be given without changing both the giver and the receiver, and her decision to share his burden had just altered the fundamental nature of their relationship in ways neither of them fully understood. The argument started over something trivial, a disagreement about trade negotiations that should have been resolved with diplomatic courtesy and political maneuvering. But the underlying tension that had been building between them for weeks finally found an outlet, and what began as a professional discussion quickly escalated into something far more personal and dangerous. "You had no right," Drakeon said, his voice tight with controlled fury as he paced the length of their sitting room. "What you did during the battle, sharing the curse's burden, it was reckless and stupid and could have killed you." His silver eyes blazed with an emotion that went far beyond anger, something that looked suspiciously like fear. "So I should have just watched you suffer?" Seraphina shot back, her own temper flaring in response to his. "I should have felt your pain through our bond and done nothing to help. That's not who I am, Drakeon. I don't stand by and watch people I care about destroy themselves, even if they're too stubborn to accept help." The words hung in the air between them like a confession neither had meant to make. People I care about. The admission changed the entire dynamic of their argument, shifting it from political disagreement to something far more intimate and terrifying. They stared at each other across the suddenly charged space, both breathing hard, both aware that they'd just crossed a line they couldn't uncross. "You don't understand what you're saying," he said, but his voice had lost its edge, becoming something softer and more vulnerable. "Caring about me is dangerous, Seraphina. Everyone who's ever cared about me has either been hurt or has learned to regret it. I'm not someone worth saving." "That's not your choice to make," she replied, moving closer until she could see the flecks of blue in his silver eyes. "And it's sure as hell not your choice to make for me." The space between them crackled with tension that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with the attraction they'd both been trying to ignore. When he reached up to touch her face, his fingers trembling slightly as they traced her cheek, they both knew they were about to step into territory that would change everything, and neither of them had the strength to pull back. The kiss never happened. At the last moment, when their lips were barely a breath apart and the air between them crackled with possibility, a commotion in the courtyard shattered the spell. Shouts, the clash of steel, and the unmistakable roar of dragons under attack pulled them back to reality with jarring suddenness. Drakeon stepped away first, his expression shifting from vulnerable to commanding in the space of a heartbeat. "The northern clans," he said, already reaching for his sword. "They've broken the ceasefire." Through the window, Seraphina could see smoke rising from the outer walls and the distinctive blue flames of clan war dragons painting the sky in shades of violence. This wasn't a raid or a border skirmish. This was a full-scale assault designed to test the strength of their newly forged alliance. What followed was unlike any battle Seraphina had ever witnessed. Fighting side by side with Drakeon, their magic intertwining in ways that felt as natural as breathing, she discovered that their bond had created something unprecedented, a perfect synchronization of power that made them devastatingly effective as a team. Her ice magic complemented his fire, her strategic mind meshed with his tactical brilliance, and together they were unstoppable. But it was what happened after the battle that truly changed everything. As the last of the clan warriors retreated and the smoke began to clear, Seraphina watched Drakeon make a choice that defied everything she thought she knew about him. A group of enemy wounded lay scattered across the courtyard, and instead of finishing them off as his reputation suggested he would, he ordered his healers to tend their injuries. "Mercy," she heard him tell his confused generals, his voice steady despite the pain she could feel building through their bond. "We show mercy, because it's what separates us from animals." The decision would cost him dearly. She could already sense the curse preparing to exact its price for the violence he'd committed, even in defense of his people. But as she watched him walk among the wounded enemies, ensuring they received proper care despite the agony it would bring him, Seraphina realized that the curse hadn't just taught him to feel pain. It had taught him the true value of compassion, even when that compassion came at a terrible personal cost. Sleep was impossible after the battle, not just because of the adrenaline still coursing through their veins, but because of the weight of everything left unsaid between them. Seraphina found Drakeon on the balcony of their chambers, silhouetted against the star-filled sky, his shoulders tense with the effort of containing the pain she knew was tearing through him like wildfire. "The curse is worse after battles like that, isn't it?" she said softly, joining him at the stone railing. "All those lives, all that violence, it's like carrying the weight of 100 deaths at once." She could feel echoes of his suffering through their bond, muted but still present, like distant thunder promising a storm. 15 years, he said without looking at her, his voice barely above a whisper. 15 years of feeling every life I've taken, every moment of pain I've caused. Do you know what that does to a person? How it changes you when every act of violence becomes an act of self-torture? His hands gripped the railing so tightly his knuckles had gone white. It makes you careful, she replied, understanding flooding through her like dawn breaking over mountains. It makes you strategic, efficient, merciful when you can afford to be. The Ice Prince isn't cold because he doesn't feel. He's cold because he feels too much. The revelation hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to find. When he finally turned to look at her, the raw vulnerability in his silver eyes nearly stole her breath. "I used to be a monster," he said simply. "Before the curse, I killed for pleasure, conquered for sport, showed mercy only when it served my purposes. The curse was supposed to teach me empathy, but instead it taught me that some prices are too high to pay, and some people are worth protecting, even from yourself." "And now?" she asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. "What are you now?" The question seemed to hang in the night air like a challenge, demanding honesty from both of them. As he reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that felt like a promise, Seraphina realized that sometimes the most beautiful transformations come from the deepest pain, and the man standing beside her was living proof that even monsters could learn to love. The ancient tome lay open on Seraphina's desk like a wound in reality itself, its pages filled with diagrams and incantations that made her stomach turn. She'd been researching for weeks, following every lead, consulting every expert, and the conclusion was always the same. Breaking the curse of empathetic retribution was possible, but the price was almost unthinkable. "The ritual of shared suffering," she read aloud to the empty chamber, her voice barely steady. "To break the curse, another must willingly take upon themselves a portion of the accumulated pain, creating a permanent bond that will distribute the burden between two souls, rather than destroying one." The words seemed to burn themselves into her mind, each syllable carrying the weight of an impossible choice. Master Aldrich had been reluctant to share this particular piece of knowledge. His ancient eyes filled with concern when she'd pressed him for details. "The ritual doesn't just share the pain, Princess," he'd warned. "It shares everything, every emotion, every memory, every moment of suffering that the curse has collected over the years. The person who volunteers becomes permanently connected to the cursed one, feeling their pain as if it were their own." But it was the final requirement that truly gave her pause. The ritual demanded absolute love, not the political alliance they'd started with, not even the growing affection that had developed between them, but the kind of soul-deep connection that poets wrote about and most people never experienced. Without that foundation, the ritual would kill them both, tearing their souls apart in the attempt to forge an unbreakable bond. As she sat in the lamplight, staring at the complex magical formulas that could free the man she'd come to love from his 15-year torment, Seraphina felt the weight of destiny settling on her shoulders. The choice before her wasn't just about saving Drakeon. It was about choosing a future where their pain would be shared, their joy doubled, and their lives intertwined in ways that went far beyond any marriage vow. But some choices, she realized, weren't really choices at all. They were simply the inevitable result of a heart that had learned to love someone else more than it feared its own destruction. The attack came at dawn, when the palace defenses were changing shifts, and the morning mist provided perfect cover for an approaching army. But this wasn't the northern clan seeking revenge. This was something far worse. The Shadow Mage Consortium, a group of rogue sorcerers who'd been exiled from the Sorceress Empire years ago, had returned with power that made the very air taste of corruption and death. "They're here for you," Drakeon said grimly, as they watched the dark army spread across the valley below like a plague of locusts. "Your marriage to me has made you a target. They see our alliance as a threat to their plans for conquest." His silver eyes were hard as steel, but she could feel his fear through their bond. Not for himself, but for her. The battle that followed was unlike anything either kingdom had ever faced. The Shadow Mages wielded corrupted magic that turned the very elements against their enemies, creating storms of acid rain and earthquakes that split the earth like rotten fruit. Against such power, conventional warfare was useless. Only the combined might of dragon fire and sorceress ice stood any chance of victory. Fighting back-to-back in the palace courtyard, Seraphina and Drakeon discovered that their magical bond had evolved into something unprecedented. Their powers didn't just complement each other, they amplified each other, creating combinations of magic that should have been impossible. Ice that burned like fire, flames that froze their enemies solid, and between them a connection so strong it felt like sharing the same soul. But it was when a shadow mage's spell nearly killed Seraphina that Drakeon truly showed who he'd become. Ignoring the agony that would follow, he unleashed the full fury of his dragon heritage, transforming into his true form and raining destruction on their enemies with a precision that spoke of years of painful experience. Every life he took would cost him dearly, but he paid that price without hesitation to protect the woman he loved. As the last of the shadow mages fell, and the corrupted magic began to fade from the air, Seraphina realized that some battles aren't won by the strongest or the most skilled. They're won by those who have the most to lose, and the courage to risk everything to protect it. The aftermath of battle was always the hardest part, when adrenaline faded and the true cost of victory became clear. Seraphina found Drakeon in their chambers, sitting on the edge of their bed with his head in his hands, his entire body shaking with the accumulated pain of every life he'd taken to protect their kingdoms. Through their bond, she could feel it like a living thing, wave after wave of empathetic agony that threatened to tear him apart from the inside. "Let me help," she said softly, approaching him as carefully as she would a wounded animal. "You don't have to bear this alone anymore." Her hands glowed with healing magic as she knelt beside him, but she knew that conventional healing couldn't touch the kind of pain that came from the curse. This required something deeper, more intimate, a sharing of souls that went beyond magic into the realm of pure love. When she placed her hands on his chest, over his heart, the connection between them flared to life with an intensity that stole her breath. But instead of pulling away, she leaned into it, opening herself completely to his pain and letting it flow through their bond until it was distributed between them. The agony was incredible, like being struck by lightning made of guilt and consequence, but it was bearable when shared. "Why?" he whispered, his silver eyes bright with unshed tears as he looked at her. "Why would you choose to feel this? You could have anyone, could have a life free from this kind of suffering. Why choose me?" The question held 15 years of self-doubt and isolation, the accumulated weight of a man who'd forgotten he was worth saving. "Because love isn't about choosing the easy path," she replied, her voice steady despite the pain flowing between them. "It's about choosing the person you can't imagine living without, regardless of the cost." As she spoke, she began to weave the preliminary threads of the ritual she'd discovered, testing their connection and finding it stronger than she'd dared hope. In that moment, as their magic intertwined and their souls touched in ways that transcended the physical world, both of them understood that they'd moved beyond the realm of political alliance into something far more dangerous and beautiful, a love that was willing to share any burden, no matter how terrible. The joint council meeting was a powder keg waiting for a spark, with representatives from both kingdoms eyeing each other across the massive oak table like predators sizing up potential prey. The recent battle had proven the strength of the Dragon-Sorceress alliance, but it had also revealed just how dangerous their enemies considered their union to be. Now, barely a week after their victory, the political vultures were circling. "The marriage has served its purpose," declared Lord Garrett, his voice carrying the arrogance of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his words. "The immediate threat has been neutralized, and perhaps it's time to consider alternative arrangements. The princess could return to her tower. The prince could seek a more traditional alliance." Seraphina felt Draken's fury through their bond like a blast of dragonfire, but his voice remained perfectly controlled when he spoke. "Are you suggesting," he said with deadly quiet, "that I dissolve my marriage because it's become inconvenient for your political ambitions?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, and more than one council member shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "We're suggesting," interrupted Lady Morwen from the Sorceress Empire's delegation, "that perhaps the princess's talents would be better utilized in a less restrictive environment. Marriage to a dragon prince, no matter how politically advantageous, limits her potential contributions to magical research and development." The irony wasn't lost on Seraphina. The same people who'd forced her into this marriage were now trying to dissolve it, apparently unaware that the political arrangement had evolved into something far more personal and powerful. "My talents," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made kingdoms tremble, "are perfectly well utilized where they are. Thank you." But it was what happened next that truly changed the game. Drakeon stood, his presence filling the room like a gathering storm, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute conviction. "This marriage will not be dissolved," he declared. Not for political convenience, not for strategic advantage, and certainly not because a group of politicians thinks they know better than we do about our own lives. As the council erupted in protests and threats, Seraphina realized that some battles aren't fought with swords or magic. They're fought with words and will, and the man standing beside her had just declared war on anyone who tried to separate them. The ritual chamber deep beneath the palace had been carved from living rock centuries ago, its walls inscribed with protective runes that pulsed with their own inner light. Seraphina had spent days preparing the space, gathering the rare components required for the ritual of shared suffering, while trying to ignore the growing dread in her stomach. Tonight, she would either free the man she loved from his curse, or kill them both in the attempt. "You don't have to do this," Drakeon said for the 100th time, his silver eyes dark with concern, as he watched her arrange the final elements of the ritual circle. "The curse is mine to bear. I've lived with it for 15 years. I can live with it for 15 more if it means keeping you safe. And I can't live with watching you suffer when I have the power to help," she replied, not looking up from the complex pattern of crystals and herbs she was creating. "We've been through this, Drakeon. The decision is made," but her hands trembled slightly as she placed the last component, a vial of her own blood, freely given, which would serve as the anchor for their permanent bond. The ritual itself was deceptively simple in concept, but terrifyingly complex in execution. She would need to open herself completely to the curse's accumulated pain, creating a pathway for it to flow between them, while simultaneously forging a permanent magical connection that would distribute the burden equally. One mistake, one moment of doubt or fear, and the backlash would destroy them both. "If something goes wrong," she began, but he silenced her with a kiss that tasted of desperation and hope in equal measure. When they broke apart, his forehead rested against hers, and she could feel his love through their bond like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "Nothing will go wrong," he said, with a conviction that almost made her believe it. "We're stronger together than apart. We've proven that in battle, in politics, in everything that matters. This is just one more fight, and we're going to win it together." As the moon reached its zenith and the ritual chamber filled with otherworldly light, Seraphina took a deep breath and stepped into the circle, knowing that in the next few hours, they would either find freedom or die trying, and either way, they would face it as one. The moment Seraphina spoke the first words of the incantation, the very air in the chamber seemed to come alive with power. Ancient magic, older than kingdoms and deeper than oceans, responded to her call with an intensity that made her bones vibrate and her vision blur. But it was when Drakeon joined his voice to hers, their words weaving together in perfect harmony, that the true magnitude of what they were attempting became clear. The curse fought back like a living thing, 15 years of accumulated pain and suffering, rising up to defend itself against dissolution. Through their bond, Seraphina felt it all. Every life Drakeon had taken, every moment of agony he'd endured, every night he'd lain awake, drowning in empathetic torment. The weight of it was crushing, like being buried alive under an avalanche of guilt and consequence. "Hold on," she gasped, her magic flaring as she struggled to maintain the delicate balance required to redirect the curse's power. "I can feel it working. The connection is forming." But even as she spoke, she could sense the ritual demanding more than she'd anticipated. The curse wasn't just going to be shared, it was going to be transformed, alchemized by their love into something entirely different. Draken's scream of agony echoed through the chamber as 15 years of suppressed pain hit him all at once, no longer filtered through the curse's gradual release, but experienced in its full, terrible intensity. Through their bond, Seraphina felt every second of it, and the only thing that kept her conscious was the knowledge that his suffering would end if she could just hold on long enough. Then, like dawn breaking after the longest night in history, something shifted. The pain began to change, transforming from pure agony into something more complex. Understanding, empathy, compassion forged in the fires of shared suffering. The curse wasn't being destroyed, it was being reborn as something beautiful and terrible and utterly unprecedented. As the ritual reached its crescendo, and their souls touched in ways that transcended the physical world, both Seraphina and Drakeon realized they were no longer two separate people bound by politics, or even love. They had become something new, something that had never existed before in the history of magic. Consciousness returned slowly, like surfacing from the depths of a dream-filled ocean. Seraphina found herself lying on the stone floor of the ritual chamber, her body aching in ways she'd never experienced before, but alive, gloriously, impossibly alive. Beside her, Drakeon was stirring, his silver eyes opening to meet hers with an expression of wonder that took her breath away. "It worked," he whispered, his voice hoarse from screaming but filled with something she'd never heard from him before. "Hope. I can feel it. The curse is still there, but it's different, shared. The pain is bearable now, distributed between us instead of concentrated in one soul." He sat up slowly, testing his body's responses like a man learning to walk again. But it was more than just the curse that had changed. Their bond, already strong before the ritual, had evolved into something unprecedented, a connection so deep and complete that they could feel each other's thoughts, share each other's memories, experience the world through two sets of senses simultaneously. It was overwhelming and beautiful and terrifying all at once. "The council isn't going to like this," Seraphina said, though she found she didn't care about political consequences anymore. "A permanent magical bond between the rulers of two kingdoms. They'll see it as either the ultimate alliance or the ultimate threat." She could already imagine the debates, the fear, the attempts to find ways to separate what could never be separated again. "Let them try," Drakeon replied, helping her to her feet with hands that no longer shook with suppressed pain. "What we have now goes beyond politics, beyond kingdoms, beyond anything they could possibly understand. We're not just married anymore. We're two halves of the same soul, and no power on earth can change that." As they stood together in the aftermath of their transformation, both could feel the curse's presence like a distant echo, still there, but no longer the crushing weight it had been. Instead, it had become something else entirely, a reminder of the price of cruelty, a source of empathy that would guide their decisions, and proof that even the darkest magic could be transformed by love. Walking hand in hand from the ritual chamber toward whatever future awaited them, they knew that some bonds are forged not in joy, but in shared suffering, and those bonds, tested in the fires of sacrifice, are the ones that last forever. 6 months later, the palace gardens had become a symbol of the transformation that had swept through both kingdoms. Where once there had been rigid separation between dragonfire roses and ice lilies, now hybrid blooms flourished, flowers that burned with cold flame, and petals that sparkled with frozen fire. It was impossible, according to every botanical text ever written. But then again, impossible things had become rather commonplace since the ritual. Seraphina stood among the impossible flowers, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly where new life grew, a child conceived in love and destined to inherit the magical legacy of two ancient bloodlines. Through their bond, she could feel Drakeon's wonder and joy mixing with her own, creating an emotional symphony that still took her breath away, even after months of shared consciousness. "The healers say it's a girl," she said as he approached, his arms wrapping around her from behind, in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "A daughter who'll grow up in a world where dragons and sorceresses work together instead of viewing each other as enemies." The future stretched before them, bright with possibilities that would have been unthinkable a year ago. The curse still existed. They could both feel it, a constant reminder of the price of cruelty and the value of compassion. But shared between them, it had become something else entirely, a source of empathy that made them better rulers, better partners, better people. Every decision they made was tempered by the understanding of how their choices affected others, and their kingdoms had flourished under leadership guided by hard-won wisdom. "Do you ever regret it?" Drakeon asked, his voice soft against her ear. "The ritual, the bond, choosing to share a burden that was never meant to be yours?" It was a question he'd asked before, and one she suspected he'd ask again, because some insecurities run deeper than magic can heal. "Never," she replied, turning in his arms to face him. "Some people spend their whole lives looking for their other half. I found mine in the most unlikely place, under the most impossible circumstances, and I wouldn't change a single moment of it." As she spoke, their daughter kicked, as if agreeing with her mother's words, and both parents laughed with the pure joy of people who had found their happy ending in the last place they'd expected to look. Standing together in their garden of impossible flowers, watching the sun set over kingdoms that had learned to live in harmony. They knew that some love stories don't end with happily ever after. They end with happily ever after. And this is just the beginning.